So good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone, especially our esteemed panelists. This is the third in our series of conversations with NCAR, where today we will be focusing on the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, or the IBC. It has now been more than 5 years since the act was institutionalizing the IBC code was passed in answer to a long-standing demand of bankers and in response to the woes of banks in recovering their dues, especially from large and powerful corporates. Instead, 5 years later and 6 amendments later, it is still seen as a work in progress. So what is the way forward? How can we realize the promise of IBC? Well, who better to answer those questions than our panel of experts? Jayant Sinha, member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee of Finance, and in fact, chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, whose report on the operation of the code was truly a landmark report. Dr. M.S. Sahu, former chairperson of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, and Pallab Mahapatra, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of the Asset Reconstruction Company of India, ARCIL, and a former banker, earlier with State Bank and with Central Bank of India, MD and CEO. So we have a lawmaker, Jayant, someone who has had the onerous responsibility of setting up a new institution, IBBI, Dr. Sahu. And of course, we have somebody who, like the rest of his tribe of bankers, was hoping to see the lending scene transformed by the IBC. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened as yet. So thank you, all three of you, for taking time out to share your views with our viewers. I intend actually to set the ball rolling by asking each of our panelists to make a brief presentation and assessment really of the IBC to date. And after that, we can discuss the specific issues. I'd actually planned to set the ball rolling by asking Jayant, since he was the author really in many ways of the Parliamentary Standing Committee report, to start by telling us what is wrong with the IBC, the IBBI, working of the code, as it were. And then I thought maybe we could ask Dr. Sahu and Pallab to respond. But Jayant has just said word that he is stuck in Parliament, so he will be joining us a little late. So just in order to kind of step in, as it were, I can never really step into his shoes, but in order to kind of just brief the audience with what were the main findings of the report, I thought I would just read out some of the main findings of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance report. So with that, let me just turn to the main findings. So as far as the role of the IBC was concerned, the committee noted that the average time to resolve insolvency was reduced as a result of the code from 4.3 years to 1.6 years between 2017 and 2020. So that is since the implementation of the IBC. But the low recovery rate and the long delays in the resolution process really points to, according to the committee, to a deviation from the original objectives of the code. In some cases, huge haircuts had to be taken, in some cases as much as almost 95%. It therefore suggested that we need to evolve some kind of a benchmark for the haircuts in comparable with global standards everywhere. As far as delays in the National Company Law Tribunal is concerned, the committee noted that out of 13,170 IBC cases involving 9 lakh crore rupees that were pending before the NCLT, 71 of these had been pending for more than 180 days. To address this delay, it recommended creating dedicated benches of the NCLTs for matters related to the IBC. To minimize delays and change in ownership of assets, it also suggested that the NCLT accept applications from the defaulters within 30 days of filing and transfer control of the company to a resolution process. The committee observed that more than 50% of the sanction strength of the NCLT is vacant and recommended A, analyzing what is the kind of capacity that is required, planning recruitment well in advance, providing virtual hearings in order to ensure that these kind of delays do not really happen. The third recommendation, which I thought was very significant, they said, was that you had something known as a pre-packaged insolvency resolution process. This had been introduced for the medium and small scale industries, the micro, small and medium MSMEs as we call them. They said that this perhaps could be extended to larger corporates as well in order to ensure that delays are cut down. As far as MSMEs are concerned, particularly in the light of the COVID experience, the committee suggested that we need to have particular extra care to the woes of the MSMEs and see what can be done to help them along, because they are small units. They do not have the kind of access that large corporates have, either to funds or to specialized professional advice. As far as the resolution plan was concerned, the committee noted that bidders may be more interested in acquiring selected businesses So if they were allowed to kind of, apply for piecemeal of the business, that might have better results in trying to sell the entire business in toto. So the committee said that maybe we should consider allowing corporates to kind of hive off some of their businesses and look for buyers for these parts. On the homeowners issue, which is something that is really kind of involved, concerns many of us as individuals, as citizens in this country, the committee noted that home buyers often face difficulties in meeting the thresholds that were established under the IBC for initiating a resolution process. And to aid mobilizing home buyers, it recommended that real estate owners provide information of other home buyers to the initiator of the insolvency proceedings. On the committee of creditors, the committee report was also not very charitable. It said that the committee of creditors have a great deal of discretion, and sometimes you accept applications and resolution plans that are submitted after the deadline. It said this may create procedural uncertainty and suggested amending the IBC so that the committee of creditors could refuse to accept any resolution plans that were submitted late. As far as insolvency professionals were concerned, the committee said that we need to improve the kind of quality of the insolvency professionals that we have. And it suggested setting up a professional body, something like the Institute of Chartered Accountants, company secretaries, etc., some kind of a professional bodies that would ensure that the resolution professionals abide by a certain discipline. And it said that in many cases, action had to be taken against resolution professionals because they did not live up to the high standards that were expected from them. On the cross-border resolution, something that we really haven't had much success and we really have to make a beginning, the committee recommended that we expedite the adoption of cross-border resolution framework. So these were really the main findings and the observations of the Standing Committee of Finance, the report that we submitted in August last year. So with that, let me now turn over to Mr. Sahu and ask Mr. Sahu, Dr. Sahu, sorry, my apologies, Dr. Sahu, that as a first person who set up the institution of the IBBI and so many other sister associations, creating the entire ecosystem really of the insolvency process, how do you react to these observations of the committee? Do you think they were excessively harsh? Is it only natural that in a country like India, when you're trying to set up something completely new, it will take time to have established procedures? Dr. Sahu.
Thank you, madam. I think most of the suggestions made in the committee do not really require recalibration of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which is the topic for today. All that, let's say, long time, low recovery, pre-pack for MSME, piecemeal sale or resolution, home buyers problem, committee of creditors code of conduct, quality of IPs, none of these requires any change in law. No calibration of law is required. At best, some of them may require changes in the regulations, and most of them have to do with our practices, business practices, regulatory practices, and developing ecosystem and capacity a little further. Since you mentioned about the setting up the institution, when we started this, we did not have experience of a modern insolvency regime in the sense that it is proactive, incentive compliant, market-led, time-bound, and therefore the code and reform was a journey into an uncharted territory. Many of the institutions required for implementation, like the IBBI. IBBI itself is there is no comparable organization of IBBI anywhere in the world. It's a unique organization. Nowhere IBBI exists. Insolvency professional agencies, appellate authority, adjudicating authority, creditors, committee of creditors, resolution applicants, information utility, all were created only after the enactment. None of them had any experience. They dealt with the matters for the first time, but we did not have the luxury to plan and better prepare to start the reforms because, as you know, IBBI was set up on 1st October 2016 with the appointment of a chairperson. And when there's no place to sit, not a laptop, not even anything, not even the salary for the chairperson, it was instructed that everything must be ready and transactions must commence on 1st December 2016, flat 60 days time. However, the entire regulatory framework in respect of service providers, corporate insolvency, the insolvency liquidation process, and entire ecosystem was put in place, transactions commenced. Yes, with experience, some difficulties surfaced, and most of those are addressed by amending the regulations. But the amendment in the code came because certain things were not anticipated in the law, like the concept of promoters, which is unique in India, which requires Section 29A to make ineligible persons with not so good antecedents to participate in the resolution process. That came from experience when you saw that Synergy Dure, the very first resolution plan was reserved where creditors have to take a haircut of 94%. Similarly, the IBC envisaged that company runs on debt money, equity money, and it did not envisage there can be some client money, which is generally a matter of a financial provider like banks and insurance companies. But we came across home buyers on whose money some companies run, and this was not very clearly envisaged. So it was clarified by the second amendment that they are the financial creditors. So these are some situations which are not envisaged, unique to India, home buyer and promoter required recasting. Similarly, certain things came because of difficulties in implementation when we came across in SR, the entitlement of financial creditors vis-a-vis of personal creditors. Or when we came across a situation where government is pursuing the enforcement agencies like Enforcement Directorate or Income Tax, they are pursuing some remedies, while the resolution applicant who is successful is not having a clean slate. Those are addressed. But this is third and fourth amendment. Fifth and sixth amendment came because of necessities in environment, precisely because of the COVID-19, when it was impossible to get a resolution applicant to resolve the stress of a company. And when everyone was failing and no resolution applicant was available, so it was decided to time being suspend the initiation of corporate insolvency resolution process in respect of defaults arising during that 1 year COVID period. The fifth amendment, the sixth amendment actually came, that is a real upgradation or giving an innovative features or value-added products as the system matures, ecosystem matured, that provided the pre-packaged insolvency resolution process. So the recalibration through 6 amendments actually addressed a very specific problem. Now, there's a tendency to ask for recalibration to address every problem. Many people believe that a new provision in the law or regulation is required to solve a problem. Too frequent calibration, I think, does not allow the law to settle, nor also no calibration prevents the law from evolving. So we have to avoid either. We should calibrate the law only when to address the issues which market cannot address, and let's not calibrate the law what market can address. From my experience of regulations, I have worked with 5 regulatory bodies so far. So I understand, particularly I have spent long years in financial markets. 2/3 of the financial market laws are in customs, only 1/3 is in case laws, in statutory, either rules, regulations, and parliamentary law. Take the example of debit and credit in accountants. There is no law to say that this has to be debited, that has to be credited. This has evolved by custom and subsequently accounting standards. So most of the solutions are available. To my mind, we do not need really any calibration. And as I told in the beginning, most of the recommendations of standing committee do not require change in the law. There are some minor requirements, but not as such. Let me start with one of the very last things you talked about, the code of conduct for committee of creditors. A corporate insolvency resolution process is an orchestra where there are 2 sets of actors. One set comprises adjudicating authority, IBBI, insolvency professional, information utility, and government. They provide the facilitation and oversight. But the second set, they are the market players. Sorry?
Yeah, please carry on.
The second set that comprises market players like the company and its management, creditors, committee of creditors, resolution applicants who take commercial decisions. The code defines the roles of these actors and stipulates timelines for each of the tasks and the process. If any of the players does not perform its role as envisaged, or does not cooperate, or acts mala fide, the process cannot conclude, process will be frustrated. Several processes have witnessed a variety of contraventions of provisions of law by market players. For the moment, I am only focusing on this part, not that I am saying that there are no problems with the adjudicating authority, insolvency professional. We have seen the contraventions by market players, and since market players are not within the regulatory discipline of the code, so far IBBI has tried 3 options to deal with such contraventions, but with varying degrees of success. One is you direct an IP that please ensure that advise committee of creditors that they shall attend the meeting, because the law does not enable giving direct direction to committee of creditors. You try to achieve by giving direction to IP, or file a complaint against a resolution applicant who does not implement the resolution plan. But to file a complaint before a special criminal court, you need a lot of evidence beyond all reasonable doubts, for which the law does not enable investigation and getting the material. Or you go on appeal, somewhere a resolution plan was approved in violation of Section 29A, an ineligible person was allowed to take over the company. Committee of creditors approved it, it was shown committee of creditors. IBBI went on appeal to NCLAT. NCLAT told, who are you? You have no locus to file an appeal against that. So the problem is that when market players, I gave the example, committee of creditor, resolution applicant, the maximum problems we have in case of promoters who do not cooperate. But this is an orchestra where everybody has to play a defined role. If they do not play their role, and there's no way to bring them to ensure that they play, then there is a problem. We used to have this kind of problem in case of a securities market. SEBI was initially from 1988 to 1995 was being perceived as ineffective in protecting the interest of investors, essentially because it did not have jurisdiction over issuers of securities. So it was directing its efforts only against the lead managers, merchant bankers who are intermediaries, signatories to prospectus, requiring them that you please ensure that companies make disclosures. And this was also being challenged. But this infirmity was addressed, which incorporated Section 11A in the SEBI Act to expand SEBI's regulatory jurisdiction over corporates in issuance of capital, transfer of security, and other related matters. So unless you bring, this is what the standing committee referred to, the code of conduct for committee of creditors is not only creditors actually who are at fault, the entire market players. There are problems on the other side also in the first set of actors. But as I told, I'm limiting now with the market players. But the players have some freedom, players have some rights and powers, but they are not subject to any discipline. And some of the players may have discipline because they are regulated bankers, but many of the financial sectors are not regulated. So this is a market system, market forces are working. So that is the problem, that we need to bring all the market participants under regulatory discipline. This is one.
Okay, Dr. Sahu, let me just interrupt you, but I think we're already also joined by Mr. Jayant Sinha. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha. I hope we didn't drag you away from Parliament. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it, because I was just saying I wanted to start off with your committee report, and Dr. Sahu just gave a very spirited defense of the working of the IBC and of the IBBI. Of course, he's done a really wonderful job. But one very heartening thing that he said, he feels that really no changes in laws are required. He says we've already seen 6 amendments, and those amendments were in response to very specific needs. Whereas now there is no need for any changes in law. All you need is to improve practices and maybe change some regulations. So would you agree with that, Sir Jayant?
Yeah, as you know, our committee examined, several areas for improvement. I think, Mr. Sahu is generally right that most of what at least we have recommended are largely process improvements and improvements in regulations. There may still be 1 or 2 areas where I think the law can be further improved. And those 2 areas, first of all, include the ways in which we can do a prepackaged bankruptcy. And I think that is being considered right now. But I think the prepackaged bankruptcy process can be strengthened somewhat by certain changes in the law. So I think that's where one area is required. And then the other area where there is still, I think, some legislative work required is in cross-border insolvency as well. Just to make sure that we are fully aligned with global best practices and standards there. So I think those are two areas where there is still some legislative work required. But otherwise, the rest of it is an evolutionary process that is best tackled through regulations, that is best tackled through setting precedents in the judicial process as well. So that is the way in which, I think the whole code should evolve at this point.
Okay, so let me just ask Pallav to join at this juncture and ask Pallav, how do you respond both to the standing committee's report, which in fact, Jayan, since you were not here, I just briefly gave out the main findings of your report, the main observations I read out, and then he's just heard Dr. Sahu. Pallav, how would you respond? How would you assess the working of the IBC? As a banker, are you satisfied with the kind of progress we've seen in resolution? Or do you think there's much more that still needs to be done as far as the IBC is concerned? Pallav?
Yeah, so Matli, I think, Namaskar, Jain Saab, and so I'm Pallav Mahapatra. While I was MD and CEO in Central Bank of India. Now I am, after retirement, I joined with the Government of India permission as MD and CEO in ART. So, sir, I have seen the bank side, and I am now seeing on the resolution side. So, sir, all the recommendations what Matli basically read out from your report are very, very pertinent. But some of these recommendations, what I feel as a practicing banker, we are doing it. Like you said, a pre-pack resolution process, which should be based on the international standards. Because when this IBC came into being, at that time also we were discussing that pre-pack is the best solution in the insolvency process. So how we are doing it, though it is not provided for in the regulation, what we do is we get in touch with some of these, I will say, resolution investors or applicants who are interested in basically taking over the company or interested in taking over the asset. So then what we do is, because there should be a smooth transition from the existing promoter to them. Because the main problem outside NCLT is that the transfer is not that smooth. Even for the sale of the assets also, there are a lot of issues because anyone can go for a securitization application in DRT, and then the process is basically held up for a long time. So we are doing it, sir, but if it is in a very, very structured, regulated way, that will help us a lot, because some of the bankers are worried that if they do this, someone in the future should not ask that whether this was a backdoor entry. So if they take a decision, so they are worried from that point of view, because with the benefit of the hindsight, a lot of questions are being asked. So this is one part. The second is your recommendation on the piecemeal resolution solution. Sir, I totally agree with this, because sometimes the investors are more interested in the slump sale of assets rather than taking over the company. Now, when in case of the slump sale of assets, if it is again through a regulatory process, that will be very, very smooth. The third is on the haircut. I do agree. A lot of criticism in the market that 94% haircut, 95% haircut. But sir, if you look at these 94-95% haircut, which have happened, or even for that matter, 80% or 75% haircut which have happened, the quality of assets which were there for which were being taken over by investor or the resolution applicant, they were not up to that mark. Again, I'm not going back to why the banks basically lent for those assets. If you look at one particular group where 94% of haircut was there, so they were in that group of companies, there were a lot of companies which didn't own any asset. They were basically either the brand company, they were either the marketing company, and why the loans were given, that is a separate matter which I am not entering into. in those cases, the value of the assets will not up to the level where anyone could have got 80, 85% or 15 or 20% of the NPA outstanding recovered. This is one point. The second is, sir, when some cases which are where there is no asset, like road project, they go into NCLT if these are incomplete projects. So these projects are basically financed by the bank based on the cash flow. And when these are incomplete because of whatever reason, so the cash flow is not that much and the value of the asset is virtually zero. In those cases, what is the alternate solution? The fourth is that sometimes the COC, because now there is a lot of news that the COC should be regulated and there should be a code of conduct for COC members. Sir, I'm not saying that all the COC members have been empowered to take a decision in the COC, but I have my own experience because when in SBI, I was the Deputy Managing Director in Stress Asset Resolution Group. When this IBC came into being in December 2016, by January 2017, February 2017, in SBI, we prepared a policy, which was IBC policy. There we defined, because the decision for in the financial matter is to be taken in the COC meeting, and if these are falling in the power of board, the board meetings cannot be conducted in a short time. So the delegation was given where the chairman or MD can take a call, then get the ratification from the board. The same thing we applied I applied in Central Bank of India, where as MD and CEO, I used to give the approval so that the person who is attending the COC meeting is empowered to take a call. So if this is followed by all banks, then there will be no delay in decision making on the part of COC, because I strongly believe that COC is what the group of lenders who are interested in getting their recovery. So if all these lenders basically follow the same structure, the problem will not be there. On the part of resolution professional, I totally agree. There should be a professional body which should regulate them, because as of now, resolution professional can be individual also. Now, individual becoming a resolution professional, and they get a basically case which has 4 or 5 factory sites, it is virtually not possible for the resolution professional to manage it. And since they are basically they become the controller, so there we have seen instances where they have basically messed up with the affair, and there have been cases of pilferage. There have been cases of where security being put by them are not up to the mark, and so these can be avoided if they are really professional in their role, and preferably we have come to a stage where above a cutoff, the individual which doesn't have the backing of IPE, insolvency professional entity, so they should not be they should not be eligible for becoming a resolution professional in such cases. These are few points, sir, and there is a need for some changes in the I will say in the procedure or regulation. But what I strongly believe is that from the law point of view, or from the act point of view, or the code point of view, it is quite I will say it is covering all the aspects, and as a practicing banker, we have not come across where the law should be changed. This is my point of view.
Okay, so those were interesting opening remarks from all three of our esteemed panelists. But Jen, since in your former avatar, you had extensive experience in the financial sector, let me ask you, why is it that similar legislation has worked so much better in the West? Or is it that we think it has worked that much better? Is it because in India we have these long judicial delays? Is it because, a debtor in possession rather than RP resolution, professional in possession is a better way of going about it? Do you have faster resolution? What is your take, Jen?
So it was my great privilege, Maithili, to have actually piloted the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code through Parliament when it was first instituted back in 2016. So I actually took it to the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, and I remember the debates well. And in those debates also, I emphasized that the bankruptcy process and the bankruptcy code is an evolutionary process, that it is a dynamic process that evolves over time. And we have to understand when the first sort of creditor courts and creditor processes were implemented either in the UK, which is largely what we modeled our IBC on, or even in the US, which actually personally I'm very familiar with, having worked extensively on both Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 processes. Now, that bankruptcy process in both the UK and the US has evolved over 100 years, if not more, right? So to think that we can short circuit 100 years of market processes developing and the various different stakeholders knowing exactly what is to be expected and getting sufficient maturity in the judicial process and in the bankruptcy processes, I think we are asking too much. Our expectations are too high. It will take time. It is an evolutionary process. And I think we've actually short-circuited quite a bit of it because we've learned a lot from other jurisdictions. But nonetheless, that institutional maturity that's required to be able to deal with these very complex cases and try and get resolution quickly so that the value in these entities is protected and preserved is going to take time. That institutional maturity takes longer than we think it does. And all that being said, I think, we've advanced down that path quite well. As I said, there are still areas that we need to work on, both in the legislation, as I said, for prepackaged as well as in cross-border. But the biggest problems and the biggest issues we are dealing with right now are much more sort of organizational and resource bottlenecks that we're dealing with. And that is where we need to really put time and effort into evolving our processes. And there I'll just give you an example, which is that, if you look at our NCLTs, we still have too high a level. There have been a number of appointments recently, so it's improved somewhat since our committee report. But in our committee report, I think we had said that there was some almost 40% vacancy rate. I think that has obviously come down, but we are already not having enough benches. We actually need to probably double the number of benches, right? So if you really look at the genuine demand that's out there, we are not able to meet the genuine demand because these are complex processes that require considerable, litigation and judicial analysis. So we massively need to raise capacity. That's one part of it. Then with respect to the resolution professionals, with respect to the ARCs, with respect to the financial institutions, again, we need tremendous maturity, tremendous training and understanding of what is happening. And then finally, on the system side, the digitization of the whole process, archiving the data, making it possible to get precedents out very easily. All of that has to mature as well. So really the challenge for us right now in the evolution of the code is in dealing with these organizational, resource and people issues more than anything else. I think the legislative framework now is quite robust and strong, but really the emphasis has to be in managing the process, enabling the process very well, and ensuring that we have the talent to be able to do this. Bankruptcy as a discipline in the US is extremely well developed. There are thousands of experienced professionals that know how to do this. There's a tremendous amount of case law to go on. Virtually every issue has already been judged or adjudicated. So there's an enormous amount of case law. Now that case law has to develop in India, the adjudication processes have to happen. People have to get to know about all of that. And so those are the things that we need to expedite at this point. And that's why it's so important to ensure that we have enough benches so that we have enough judicial capacity. And at the same time, everybody in the industry knows that you are much better off and you can be much more efficient if you can do these things before you get into the judicial process. Already that is happening in India, but the vast majority of these situations in more mature jurisdictions like the US and the UK are settled before they go to court. So we have to develop all of those skill sets. We have to develop all of those habits. It's happening very rapidly. We are already evolving into a relatively sophisticated and mature jurisdiction. And that is excellent, but we still have quite a long way to go yet.
Okay. Yeah, I think Jayant, your words of music to Dr. Sahu's ears. I could see him smiling because he was saying exactly the same thing, that we need to have the institutional structure and strengthen it. But then how would you measure success of something like IBC? Would you measure the success in terms of how quickly issues are resolved? Or is it by how much is realized? Which is a better yardstick of success of something like the code, Jayant?
It's not either or, Maithili. You need to look at both the speed of resolution, because the two are interconnected. The speed of resolution and actually the realization, both are very important. The longer the process takes, the lower the realization, because obviously these assets erode over time, right? And particularly in India, where security of equipment and all of those things is very difficult to achieve, we are going to see a lot of these kinds of assets being stolen, being pilfered, being sort of contested. So we need to move quickly through the process, and that's why the institutional maturity, the resources, the benches, all of these things become so very important. So we have to make sure that the process moves smoothly, that friction is taken out of the process, that there's sufficient capacity. If we do that, I think the realizations will also be much higher.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. Yes, the two are very closely connected. But one last question, Jayant, before I move over to Dr. Sahu, that Dr. Sahu said that really we don't need any more amendments. From what you said, I think you said only pre-packs are perhaps the only amendment that is required. So is that just one amendment that you feel is necessary, or is the law complete in itself?
No, I said cross-border insolvency is another area where we need to do more legislative work. Exactly what this will entail in terms of the drafting and the language itself, I really have not gone through and looked at it very carefully. So I don't know exactly to what extent the drafting will be complicated. But I think those are the two areas where we need some further legislative work.
Dr. Sahu, how would you like to react to what Jayant has said? I think you would agree with almost everything that he said, right, Dr. Sahu?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we require institutional maturity. We need amendments in the code for certain aspects, but many low-hanging fruits are there, which we can pluck quite quickly. Like the Honorable Chairman of the Standing Committee, Mr. Sinha, mentioned about the capacity at NCLT. I was focusing earlier on one aspect of changing in the law, and two other aspects. Pre-pack, there are issues, and I do not know why it was decided to limit pre-pack only to MSME corporates, while the implementation of individual insolvency, which includes the proprietorship and partnership firms, they are in business, their number is about 6 crore, and they are not able to avail this benefit. But the initial thinking, or as per the committee report, was to make pre-pack available for everybody. So I'm coming back to the, let's say, 2-3 operational things which can be done without changing in law, and which has become really a stumbling block. Like what happens today, resolution plan remains pending before the adjudicating authority. There are some plans which are pending for a few years, and then it becomes unviable in the changed business environment. Resolution applicant, as per the latest order from the Supreme Court in ABIX Singapore in August 21, the resolution applicant cannot back out of the plan. But if he implements the plan, the company may not survive. Resources he brings in may go down the drain, even dragging him as well into insolvency. So it's a huge risk for an applicant to implement a resolution plan, unviable resolution plan, since people will not like to take such delay-induced risk. They would try to avoid submitting resolution plans. This will really dry up the pipeline of resolution plans, and consequently, there will be liquidation of even viable companies. This concern, Honorable Supreme Court noted in the ABIX. It's stated that the judicial delay, which has been one of the major reasons for failure of insolvency regime that existed prior to IBC, and we cannot allow the present regime meet the same fate. So unless we address this bottleneck, there will be no one who will be willing to submit a resolution plan, wait for 3 years, 2 years, and when the plan has become unviable and then you force him to implement, better you would avoid submitting a resolution plan. Delay is happening for so many other reasons, as I mentioned earlier, but this is within the fully doable by the state. honorable chairman mentioned about the United States and UK. You look at United States system of bankruptcy. Their bankruptcy courts have exclusive jurisdiction on all matters, chapter 7, 9, 11, 12, 15, individual, corporate, liquidation, bankruptcy, all matters are dedicated, unified at one place. And they have a total authorized judgeship of 350. And how this number has been arrived at? This has been arrived at by a time study data by the US Government Accountability Office. They are judges, they are appointed for 14 years and they have enough adequate research and support, so they develop the capacity in the course of time. And only one judge, not a bench of two judges, that conducts and disposes of the proceedings. And there's a dedicated procedure called Federal Rules of Bankruptcy Procedure. Unlike in our case, the NCLT DRT rules govern bankruptcy processes. So if you, for a country of India's size and the kind of companies and individual insolvency, once we start implementation of insolvency, that will come up. Knowing that the commercial matters are outside the domain of the adjudicating authority, knowing that the insolvency proceedings are not litigation, I think a single one member can dispose of, we can have a unified, dedicated adjudicating authority to deal with all matters of insolvency, liquidation, and bankruptcy of corporates. And only one member, single member, appellate authority, adjudicating authority can comprise of only one member. This will double the existing capacity immediately. Modernizing the apparatus, that was also emphasized in the standing committee report. The administration can scrutinize the filings for accuracy, completeness, compliance, so that the adjudicating authority focuses on adjudication. Information technologies should be used. There should be dedicated procedure, as I mentioned. Simpler processes like a fresh start, for which there was a committee headed by Justice Sri Krishna, which recommended that can be taken out of the adjudicatory process and the administrative process can do it. Voluntary liquidation, which do not entail major disputes, these can be handled outside the adjudicating authority. Processes like a pre-packet insolvency resolution, bringing in a mediation into this insolvency process, these will take away load from the adjudicating authority. But while some of the measures will take time, but immediate relief will come from increasing the strength of the adjudicating authority. A back of the envelope calculation we have done. If I just adopt the US parallel, they presume 48 work weeks, daily working hour is this much. A case of individual insolvency takes 12 minutes, some case takes 1 hour, big cases takes a longer time. If I just replicate those numbers here and considering the present workload of NCLT, as including the workload it handles under the Companies Act, and also continuation of the disposal by a bench of 2 members indicates that we need about 360 members from the present level of 63. Though admittedly US parallel is not strictly appropriate, but the so huge gap indicates something that we need to do.
Oh, well, absolutely. There are, agreed, large lacunae in terms of the numbers required in the NCLT and NCLAT. But Pallav, I think Dr. Sahu and Jayant made a number of interesting observations. I was a little intrigued by Dr. Sahu's comment about unviable resolution plans. That seems to be a contradiction in terms, because resolution suggests that, okay, you're finding an answer to the problem, but he said either they become unviable because of the passage of time, or to start with itself, they are not really very viable. And I think this is where the IBBI has been asking for some kind of regulation over the committee of creditors. But as a banker, after all, bankers, they are the ones who have lent the money. They have skin in the game. So why should there be any need for a third party to regulate them? I think this is where the bone of contention lies. Should the committee of creditors be regulated by the IBBI, or should they be sufficiently bothered about protecting their own interests as to kind of ensure that the best deal is struck? Pallav, what is your view?
Actually, as I said earlier also, because the committee of creditors are nothing but the lenders. There, as you rightly said, they have the skin in the game. Their money is involved. Of course, their money is depositors' money. But regarding the unviable resolution plan, to be very frank, as a practicing banker, I have not come across where knowingly the COC has taken a call or decision in favor of an unviable resolution plan. Why the plan becomes unviable, as Dr. Sahu has pointed out, that one of the reasons is that with the passage of time and some sort of litigation going on, the issue which should have been sorted out in 180 or 270 or 330 days, it has taken more than, say, 1 year or 2 years. So that particular resolution plan during that particular period becomes unviable because it is very difficult to ensure that whatever the assets are there, that assets quality will remain the same, the quantity will remain the same, because this is our practical experience that pilferage happens. Now, maybe the orders which are in hand at that point of time when the resolution plan was given by the resolution applicant, now the buyers will not wait for 2 years to keep those orders. So gradually the viability of, with the passage of time, the viability of the resolution plan comes down. Unlike 2-3 cases where despite a delay, despite the promoters basically trying to play around Article 14 of the Constitution and always trying to bring in some litigation, the resolution applicant stuck to the plan, and there the realization was very, very good. But such cases, I don't know how many such cases will be there in the system. Regarding the regulation of the COC, what I strongly believe is that the COC is nothing but the bankers and NBFCs or any type of financial institution. So the bankers and the NBFCs are regulated by Reserve Bank of India. And if there will be another body to regulate these lenders, so there may be a duality, and in the process, it may lead to some sort of a confusion. I will still maintain that although there is a lot of things are said against the COC members, that they unnecessarily take more time, they normally do not attend the COC meetings, or they are not sending senior people to these meetings. But this was initially there, but with the passage of time, most of the banks have matured, and they are taking this particular process very, very seriously, because they know that if they miss out on this particular process, they are not going to, they will be getting a zilch out of any resolution plan, because automatically it will go into liquidation, and the liquidation process, to be very frank, the results are not good, because the amount which is to be realized in 2 years, so the realization is not happening, and so liquidation is I will say, is virtually the entire process going down the drain. So on the regulation part, I still believe, I still have faith in the lenders that they are self-regulated. They will not do anything to basically diminish the value of the asset. They will try to take the decision so that timely resolution is done. Most of them have started believing that there is a time value of money, and if they miss out on this aspect, so they will be the sufferer on account of this. So let the Reserve Bank of India, or for that matter, in certain cases, if mutual funds are there, then SEBI, let them remain as the regulators. Let them regulate these entities. But there should be a uniformity among the regulators also, who are the regulators of the financial institutions, that all of them should be on the same page. In some case, SEBI had a different view that no, we will not agree for 60% of the bondholders to give up to vote on that. We will like to have 100%. So these are type of things where I think either the legislation or the law or something should basically make these changes. Though there is a forum where the regulators meet, but sometimes I have seen that there are difference of views in such cases, and in some cases as bankers we had to basically play the mediatory role among the regulators. So this is one aspect where, if suppose through the law, the the uniformity is brought in among the regulators. The second is let these entities be regulated by the existing regulators. If there is another regulator which is brought into being, then it will add to a lot of confusion on the financial.
Jayant, would you agree that is there a case for the COC, the Committee of Creditors, to be regulated by the IBBI, or they're already regulated largely by the Reserve Bank of India, because most of the creditors are banks, and where there are a few cases where SEBI also is a regulator. So is there a case for the IBBI to step in as another regulator? What is your view, Jayant?
So let's take a step back, Maithili, and try and understand why is it that we suggested that there should be a code of creditors. What was the problem we were trying to solve? One is that we saw great variation between some creditors, the best banks and their personnel, and other banks. So there was a great variation in the performance of bankers across the spectrum. The other thing that we heard when we did our hearings was that there were some examples where it was felt that bankers actually were operating on a malified basis, that they were actually doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And because there was no clear code of conduct, it was possible for them to justify it or to get away with it, right? And so that's why we recommended a code of creditors. Now, we didn't in our report, to the best of my knowledge, suggest that it should be done by the RBI or some other regulator. If you ask me personally what my view would be, and this is not the committee's view necessarily, this is my own personal view as to how it should be done. I think the IBA should formulate as self-regulation a code of for the creditors, which is how should bankers operate through the adjudication process, through the resolution process. What should they do, right? And that should be a template for bankers as they move into it, which is, senior people should be on the committee. There should be meetings this often. These are the kinds of expectations as to how you will process it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is really self-regulation is what I would argue. It should be through the Indian Banks Association, and it should be a gold standard that is put out there so that everybody can measure themselves against it and recognize that they need to improve their performance and that, if they're falling short, they know exactly why they're falling short. So I think that's really how the code of creditors should be applied. I think there's already over-regulation in any case as far as India's financial system is concerned. We shouldn't be telling, senior bankers literally, what they should be doing, when they should be doing it. Let's leave it to their judgment. But I think bankers themselves should try and put together a set of best practices and tell, their other colleagues, look, this is what we expect you to do when you go through a resolution process. And I think that's really the value that a code of creditors can provide, so that it becomes crystal clear when you're not operating as per the gold standard or you're not operating on the gold standard. Now, I think I would leave it for IBA also to be able to determine what to do in the case when there are violations. But in the specific instance when there is a violation of this gold standard or this set of practices that IBA puts out, then from a adjudication process, it becomes very clear to understand where the gap is, right? We were expecting you to do this, you didn't do that. And that then will have certain implications. Again, I would not be too much sort of trying to regulate even that and say, if you didn't do this, then this is the penalty that you should get. I don't think we can be that prescriptive. I think it depends on the circumstances and it depends on the situation, but at least it's very valuable input into the resolution process or in litigation thereafter, if indeed there has been a gross deviation from what the IBA itself believes is the right way to conduct yourself through this kind of process. That's the way at least I personally would approach the code of creditors. I would not make it something that the RBI will be regulating or IBBI should be regulating. I think it should be very much something that's self-regulation by the Indian Banks Association.
Yes, of course, I think self-regulation really is the best way to go. But Jayant, is one of the criticisms that was made about the Committee of Creditors was that in a couple of cases, they had accepted a bid after the deadline was over. And there was this argument that, bankers need to get the maximum, you recover the maximum amount. Should they be bound by the deadline in terms of timeliness, or should they go after the maximum amount? What is your personal view? Because I think the committee came down.
Yeah, that's a classic. That's a classic example as a policymaker that you deal with, where you can argue for a instance that, wait a second, you could have got 100 and you only got 80. So maybe it's true in that one instance. But if you look at it, system wide, and you enable people to come in after the process is over, you are creating all kinds of counterproductive behaviors in the system that in the long run are going to be much, much more damaging for the system as a whole. And that's, again, as I said, a classic example of where if you are a policymaker and you're thinking about the system rather than of an instance, you will come to a different conclusion. Obviously, as a policymaker looking at the system and what you're setting as a precedent, if you have a deadline, you have a deadline. Your bids have to come in by that deadline, and then that's it. And then the door is shut and we will not entertain any more bids. And that is something that we pointed out in the report as well, which is that, deadlines have to be maintained. Otherwise, you're compromising the entire system. And in the future, just because in one instance, you believe you could have gone from 80 to 100. Right. So I think, again, as a policymaker who's responsible for providing views on what the rules should be longer term to create a healthy system that works well, I would not be in favor of that approach where post deadline, just to maximize proceeds from a single case, you corrupt the entire system as a whole.
Oh, yes. Dr. Sahu, would you agree with that assessment that you need to abide by these deadlines? And as it is, we have such long delays. So
absolutely. That is how market works. People want a predictability of the process. But coming back to the earlier issues when I was talking about, it is not only the conduct of committee of creditors. The process is being derailed by the conduct of promoters or companies or resolution applicants. So in that context, I was telling that all market players who are taking decisions, they need to subject to some discipline. Incidentally, for many of the creditors, financial creditors, there is a regulator, but there are many financial creditors. Number-wise, they are much more. They may not have much voting power, who are outside the regulatory jurisdiction of RBI. In any event, when you want to do something, bring in some discipline, ideal course is to start with a voluntary approach, help them to organize among themselves. Only when that IBA approach that helps to achieve, then we move to next level of regulations. But every time you start with the, like in medicine, you start with the lowest grade, the lowest potent medicine. It does not work, you go for a higher potent medicine. But I do not agree with Mr. Mahapatra that there is one regulator. One, I told you, RBI does not regulate many financial creditors. But when a bank makes a public issue, it is regulated by SEBI, not by RBI. So it's not that today we are doing kind of activity-based regulation. We have moved away long back from entity-based regulation that RBI will do everything about banks. So it is not, there is no conflict, no issue if one entity complies with 10 regulators for 10 different aspects. Absolutely no issue actually. And that's why I gave you the example of SEBI was not being effective till 95 because it was only directing the efforts through merchant bankers and brokers or even stock exchanges to the issuers of companies. But the market players are issuers of companies until they were brought into regulatory discipline in 95. Till 95, we had all the kinds of fly-by-night operators. But all those stopped only when they were subject to some discipline. As Honorable Chairperson mentioned, there are many matters where there are commercial issues, there are improper conduct issues which have come in respect of COCs. I am actually, in addition to conduct, the commercial things are coming on, becoming a big bottleneck. In the sense, committee of creditors is not behaving like a business person. Again, since I am more familiar with the financial market, when a company makes a public issue, wants to sell a few shares to millions of individual investors, how much of effort it makes to publicize it and make people see the value in his equity. But here what happens is most of the creditors, they leave it to IP. You just formality was said, issue an advertisement, invite an expression of interest. And only when the plans come to us, we take a call whether to accept it or not. And thereafter also, they really do not get into, though they talk about feasibility, viability, really they do not go into those things. They generally look at it mechanically, whether the value I am getting is more than liquidation value or not. So I think they have to become more business-like. Their capacity improvement, I have seen IBBI has been doing, and recently I saw also they have scheduled another program for a committee of creditors. Lot more effort is required to build the capacity of committee of creditors, as much as required also building the capacity of insolvency professionals.
Okay, so Pallav, let me ask you to respond to Dr. Sahu's accusation, quote unquote. He says the committee of creditors, of which you as a banker are very much part of, he says you're not behaving like businessmen. You're going about the entire process very mechanically, as if it was somebody else's money almost, as he seems to suggest. So what would you say, Pallav? Because we're almost coming to 7:30, and I think it's time to open up to question answers. And we have got some questions from the audience, but I'd like to hear your point of view, Pallav. Is it that bankers are truly indifferent?
Yeah, Madly, I don't want to debate on these points. There may be cases, and as a banker, I can say there are also instances where bankers have themselves tried to find out or get in touch with some potential resolution applicant, and they have arranged for that. As I earlier said that though this pre-pack process is not so far institutionalized, but bankers are still doing that, and may not be in all the cases. So I 100% don't agree with that. The bankers are not behaving like a businessman, because it is at the end of the day the money which the bankers have lent to the borrowers. They try their level best. Maybe in some instances it might have gone in a very routine manner or a mechanical way, but over a period of time, the bankers have also matured. And there are instances where we have got the resolution applicant identified much before the EOI has been floated. Now, the issue is again that if suppose because in the Western world, what happens is the bankers or the stress asset outfit, what they try to do is they buy the asset, at the same time, they also have some buyer of those assets. So that is back-to-back arrangement. But that back-to-back arrangement is not basically, I will say that not put against those entities in the future. As of today, the bankers are really skeptical about it, that if questions are raised to us in future, that why you talk to the possible potential resolution applicant when the process was going on. So these are some issues. There's some element of I will say skepticism, or I will say the fear is there. But as the process is evolving, in the same way, the COC members are also maturing, and I won't say that they have reached to the full maturity, but the process is going on. On what Honorable Chairman said regarding the timelines of the process, I 100% agree. And I have myself objected in some cases where there were some resolution plans which came after the deadline. I said, what is the guarantee? First of all, this particular resolution applicant will honor the plan, number one. Number two is why he didn't basically submit the plan within the timeline which was in the public domain. So if we keep on doing it, then what will happen is there will be a second resolution applicant who will come with another plan. And this will keep on going. So there is a time value of money. We should basically say enough is enough, put up stop here. So I 100% agree, because the system is to basically respected rather than getting some or maximizing the realization or recovery amount. So these are the two points which, of course, Dr. Sahu is more experienced on the policy and the legislation side. But from the practical experience, what we have come across is we have matured a lot, and still there is a long way to go.
Oh, yes, indeed. But as Jen mentioned, it is very much a work in progress, and we have kind of come considerable distance. So one thing is certainly there, that the equation between lenders and borrowers has suddenly changed. Whereas earlier you had large borrowers dictating terms to bankers, today bankers are in a position to dictate at least some terms to them. But I think it's now past 7:30, and we have got some questions from our audience. So let me start with a question from Krishna Kumar. He says a set of RBI's dirty dozen, the first 12 that were recommended to the IBBI under the IBBI process, accounted for a large share of the initial NPAs in the system. And these are mostly firms whose fortunes were inextricably linked with the downside in the commodity price cycle. So is our assessment of the success of the insolvency regime, factoring in this extraneous circumstance because of the down cycle in the commodities space, because of that, these 12 dirty dozen got into those problems. So is our view colored by what happened on the commodity price cycle? Jayant, would you like to go on that?
Well, bankruptcies come in clusters, and those clusters are very often triggered by exogenous events. There may be a down cycle in commodities. There may be, some kind of an, external economic shock that happens. And then, of course, for example, then you have a whole series of bankruptcies as well. So these bankruptcies are, in fact, in many cases driven by exogenous shocks. Companies are financially fragile in some cases. They're getting along, in some sort of very day-to-day basis, but the shock comes and suddenly they are underwater, right? And then you have a whole cluster of bankruptcies. So this is the way the economic environment tends to work. And in this particular instance, we had a cluster of defaults because, yes, the commodity cycle had gone down and we got a cluster of defaults. But that's really how the whole process happens. By and large, if things are going well, then people are able to get through it. It's when things go south, that's when these problems happen. So it's completely natural is what I would say.
Dr. Sahu, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think not just these big 12. If you look at the larger set of 25,000 companies which have gone through NCLT process, 4,500 admitted, the rest settled somewhere on the way. Our experience is that of these 12 are chronic cases. And if you look, I look at the entire universe of 25,000, 75% of them have defaults prior to IBC code came into existence. And many of them, the very fast resolution plan I refer to Synergy Dure, it was going on since 2004, it was in a BIFR. So it's not that commodity prices or business cycles or oxygen factors came all of a sudden and things went bad. These have been happening for last 10, 15, 20, 35 years. So was that the commodity price or business cycle was bad for entire 30 years? Was there no upturn? One. Second, these big 12 included many steel companies. Why many steel companies were still doing well, but these few companies were not doing well? Is it a problem with the steel market? There are many companies in steel business. They were doing very well in 2016, 17, 18. But why these few companies were not doing well? So something wrong with that company itself rather than the exogenous environment. And when it came to process, these steel companies, they got good realization. Even for that SR, they got about 85, 90%. But there are people who are willing to give you 100%. So I don't subscribe to the view that the exogenous factors contributed to this. Yes, it would have contributed. COVID is a thing which really contributed for every business. That's why government suspended the proceedings for some time. But if in a other than COVID kind of situation, when every other business in the industry is doing well and I am not doing well, the problem is with me, not with exogenous factor.
Okay, well, Dr. Sahu was not at all inclined to be in the least charitable to these people. But do you agree with him that it is because you really need to separate the wheat from the chaff? And what happened really with the IBC is that it enabled this to happen. So it is not only because of the commodity down cycle, but because some of the promoters were genuinely gaming the system and needed to be, quote unquote, brought to book. Palla?
Yeah, Maitri, I think I agree with both Honorable Chairman Sahab as well as Dr. Sahu on this. It is not only the external factors, and we also learned the process through a very difficult, in a difficult manner. Like I will give you an example. There is a, whenever we finance the project, or even for that matter, whenever we give a term loan, so there is a cost of project and there is a means of financing, right? Very in simple terms. In the means of financing, earlier, the banks were considering the internal accruals as the equity part of the promoter. They learned this in a difficult way, that internal accruals is basically what? This is the system or that particular unit is generating. So where is the skin of the in the game of the promoter? Now, after that, after all these things, after the AQR, most of the banks have made it compulsory that, number one, there will be no internal accruals which will be considered as the equity from the borrower. They have to bring in their equity upfront so that they have the skin in the game. As Dr. Sahu said, there were cases which went into BIFR failed, which went into CDR failed. So these are the cases where why the failure happened, because the promoters were not able to bring in their margin or their equity. As long as they are basically doing the business on the accruals from the business itself, so their skin in the game is not there. So if any shock happens, they will be the first one who will leave it. So the baby will be only with the lenders. So banks have learned it through a hard way. But again, see, it is not that everyone is perfect from day one. So they have learned. They have learned that that when they are financing basically the acquisition of plant and machinery by the borrower, they have to basically not only do the due diligence on this supplier, they have to also see that whether there are related party transactions with them. They have to basically get independent opinion on those suppliers. They have to basically put the O&M consultants before that. In case of the road projects or infra projects, now they are putting their own concurrent auditors. They have the agency for basically supervising and monitoring the entire cash flow of the unit. So we have learned, ma'am. And it is, though it was on something went wrong on account of, I will say that ignorance, something, as the Honorable Chairman said, that some bankers might have gone into the malafide side, but that I don't know. But normally this happened that say consortium, then multiple banking, then who is financing what. Someone is basically financing against the pledge of shares of the promoter, and some of the lenders are financing the working capital, but they don't know that the same receivables are being financed by all the banks or not. So this is learning through the process, and I think whatever we have seen in the past, in all probability, that will not recur.
Jayant, you spoke about how insolvencies occur in waves, and that is the commodity down cycle, which did lead to the initial round of so many insolvencies that we saw, which brings me to the next question, which has been asked by Sahana Roy Chaudhary of IMI Kolkata. She says that how relevant is the IBC in this kind of COVID atmosphere? Given this kind of scenario, is there a case to suspend IBC for much longer than it has been suspended? Because this is something that affected the entire economy. Jayant.
So that's an excellent question. And it really gives you pause to think about a situation where something that macro happens that affects everybody in the economy and is clearly something that is outside of people's control. So you can ask yourself whether the right answer is to pause the whole resolution process, or whether it is to provide much more credit and liquidity so that you can be able to deal with it that way, or to do both. Now, in our particular case, what we've done is we've done both. So we've provided a pause for the resolution process for halting IBC. That's what happened. We provided a significant amount of support for companies as well. And of course, the government did a whole host of other measures to get people through the process. So you have to take extraordinary measures at extraordinary times. And I think that is basically what we had to do in this particular case. But again, this was a unique once in a century type situation where all such measures are on the table. And in effect, you actually have to apply all of them to get people through a very, very difficult time.
I have another question. This has been asked by Dinesh Kumar, and I think this perhaps Pallav will be best poised to answer this. He's written that the success of a corporate entity depends on the effective demand-linked production function. So if banks really do a proper appraisal of the credit at the time that the borrower approaches the bank, then many of these problems might have been avoided. So are banks failing in their credit appraisal? Pallav.
Matri, if you talk in a present continuous way that whether the banks are still failing, I will say no, because banks have learned the lesson. And so they are now, to a great extent, they are doing a proper assessment of the requirement. And after doing a lot of due diligence only, they are basically giving the loan. It is not as simple as what used to happen earlier. As I said that I gave one example that banks are now not accepting internal accruals as the equity. Same way, the banks, even after the disbursement, they are closely monitoring the cash flow of the company. So a lot of measures have been taken, and so they do lot of pre-sanction assessment and due diligence before they take a call. So the whatever was the problem in the asset quality in the past, so those to a great extent those things have been corrected in the system, in the process, in the assessment, in the appraisal. So I don't think that that type of situation the country will see again.
Jayant, one of the suggestions made by your committee was that you need to have a benchmark for the kind of haircuts that could be allowed by creditors. Now, does this in some way, tie their hands, as it were? Because how do you have a benchmark? It would vary from case to case. Does it have, take away entirely any scope for judgment, for discretion when you have a benchmark for haircuts?
Yeah, so that's another very good question, Maithili, and unfortunately, I'll have to answer that and then sign off because my next meeting is starting. But that was a recommendation that led to a lot of discussion. And that was the intent, of course, because what we were finding was that the benchmark effectively was becoming the liquidation value. So willy-nilly, creditors were saying that as long as we can do better than liquidation value, we'll accept, what is coming out of the resolution process. So what we were saying was that, we have to think carefully about benchmarks. It shouldn't be that the benchmark should be the liquidation value, right? The benchmark needs to be better than that. And there has to be some thinking. Again, the idea here is not to be prescriptive. The idea here is not to be overly pedantic about saying that this is the right answer and this is not the right answer. But to be able to say, generally, if you come in early and you deal with the situations, you should be able to recover most of the debt, right? Because ultimately, remember, when you put somebody into the resolution process, you're already wiping out a set of claimants, which are the equity holders. They're already down to zero, right? And if anybody has done their underwriting well, you should be able to claim, at least your credit, your debt back. So to be in a situation where people are saying the liquidation value is 10, 20% of asset value, and that's all you're getting back, or of the outstanding liabilities, and that's what you're getting back, that seems like a benchmark that is not appropriately thought through, but that you should really be able to understand, in certain situations, you should be able to recover most of your debt. In other situations, it may be less than that. But there needs to be some understanding across the system as to how you have to think about those situations and what potential benchmarks could be, ranges of those benchmarks could be. But to have this view developing within creditors that as long as you're doing better than liquidation value, it's okay, in my view, is not okay. Because remember, as I said right at the outset, you're wiping out equity holders anyway. So you're dismissing all their claims.
Absolutely. That is certainly true. And I thank you so much, Jayant. I understand you have to leave, but thank you very much for taking time out and coming away from Parliament also, despite your pressing duties. Thank you very much. I think we'll carry on with discussion with Pallav and Dr. Sahu. Thank you very much once again, Jayant, from all of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Sahu, if I can address that same question to you, benchmarks for the kind of, haircut. What is your view on that?
I think you have to understand why this benchmark we are talking about. We are talking about this based on the assumption that haircuts have been very high. But are they really high? It all depends on how you look at it. World Bank, which assesses different jurisdictions in terms of insolvency, in their last assessment, which refers to October 19, because thereafter they are not having their ease of doing business report. There they found that realization in India is 71.6 cents on dollar. But we calculate a different way and then find that there's a huge bill. The haircut is too high. So why does World Bank does not find so much of haircut? Why do we find it so much of haircut? So we have to understand how we are calculating. That calculation is creating all the problems. It's quite deceptive. Today, by realization, we are meaning whatever money comes to us, comes to the creditors. That is resolution value, you can call it. We are not considering in that percentage of haircut, we are not including the money the creditors will get from disposal of avoidance transactions. The applications for avoidance transactions valued at 1.7 lakh crore as per the IBBI's latest news report are pending before different tribunals. There are guarantors, personal guarantors who have to also make good if the money from the corporate could not be realized. Applications today for realizing 66,000 crore are pending before tribunals. So you have to add to the money you are getting today, which you are saying 35, 40%, whatever, add to that money that will come from evidence transaction, money that will come from guarantors, money that will come from, in some cases, there are equity allotted to the bankers. So the one which got so much of criticism, the Videocon with a 95% haircut, that's an equity component there also. So you have to include these, all these to first find out the numerator. Then in the denominator, again, if I go back to the same example of 95%, the way we add up the claims, we add up a claim, there is a loan I have taken. So I add, that is a claim amount. On that, there's interest on interest, written up claims written up 10 years ago. Those are also included. And also the guarantee is included. That means in case of Videocon, there's a guarantee of 25,000 crore, which one of the entities of Videocon had given to a banker on behalf of a group entity in foreign country. So there's a claim for that 25,000 crore made against a foreign entity for giving the loan, and against that loan, claim against a guarantee is submitted here. So most often, wherever the loan has a guarantee, this is claimed twice. There's a duplication. If you actually remove that 25,000 crore from Videocon, the haircut will drastically reduce from 95 to something else. So it is how you count. There's a double counting of guarantee. And as you mentioned, someone was mentioning about that 12 DACTI accounts with a 1/4 of NPA. Actually, NPA has no meaning in this context, because we have seen the companies which have come to IBC, against them claims, aggregate claims against them is about 30 lakh crore. At any point of time, we say NPA is 10 lakh crore or so. Where the 30 lakh crore is coming? These are the written up amount written up in the last so many years. So which we never expected to realize. That's why quite often the entire realization goes to profit and loss account of the banker. They are not the normal NPA things. Then you have to see, it's axiomatic. Company coming to IBC does not have assets to fully pay its creditors. When they come to the IBC process, the amount, the value of the assets available with the company is about less than 20% of the amount of claim. That means at the beginning, the creditors are staring at a haircut of 80+%. The IBC not only rescues those companies, it reduces haircut to 60%. So that means you have to see what is available on the ground, how much of assets are there, what is the liquidation value of those assets. Compared to that, how much you are getting. If you had adopted liquidation value approach, company would have liquidated, you would have got a liquidation value minus cost of liquidation, and company would have died. But the creditors have now got 180% of the liquidation value and company has survived. So you need to see what is available on the ground, not that how much you are supposed to get even if assets do not exist. We got criticism, the Bhotiranga Minerals, Orchid Orchid Healthcare. These two companies owed 9,000 crore to creditors. When they came to IBC, they had absolutely zero assets. Creditors got absolutely zero, 100% haircut. And it got a lot of press publicity. What is this IBC? But if you start with zero assets, zero cannot become one. If you have one, it can become 1.5. But if you start with zero, that means actually recently the Honorable Minister mentioned, replied in the Parliament on 6th of December. There are so many factors on which the value of realization depends. The time when you start the process, how much time you take for resolution, nature of business, business cycle, market sentiment, marketing effort, and most important is at what stage of the stress the company enters IBC. Like a patient, when is he arriving at hospital? If the patient is brought dead, the best doctors can't do anything. So if a company has been sick for years and assets have depleted significantly, IBC IBC may yield haircut or even liquidation. So you have to look at what is the right parameter to look at haircut, not just how much you are to get and how much you are getting. That is not haircut meaning in finance actually. If you look at finance, encyclopedia, you go those kind of finance meaning is not that. We have created a word haircut by linking money I get in relation to what I should have got. But what you should have got has no meaning today.
Okay, so Pallav, we are almost at the end of our time. I think we have only about 4 minutes left, but I think Dr. Sahu made a very impassioned, in defense of how haircuts are to be calculated and how IBC's performance has not been so bad. I'm sure you agree with a lot of what he said, but I wanted to have your view on personal guarantees. How easy is it really been for banks to ensure that the personal guarantees are honored? And do they really ever recover anything at all from personal guarantees of promoters of corporates? Pallav.
Natalie, this personal guarantee rules were notified last year only, right? If I am correct. So now most of the banks are going for filing the bankruptcy against the personal guarantors under Section 95 of the IBC code. So I will say that the majority of the cases so far have not been decided upon. And when we get the results out of that, then we will come to know that whether this is making the impact. But on the part of this haircut, I agree and also I disagree with Dr. Sahu. I agree on the point that what is the denominator which should be taken? Now, the denominator, he is right that there are instances of duplication. There is not only the bank guarantee which has been issued, which is added. There is also the corporate guarantee. Someone has given the corporate guarantee. Now, they will basically put a claim on that corporate guarantee also. So, suppose this particular company, which is in the NCLT, has given the corporate guarantee for some loan given to some other entity by another bank. So, that bank will also file the claim. So, and that company, if it is taken to the NCLT, there also they will file the claim. So, there is a lot of duplication. And as he rightly said, that accrued interest also becomes, because if the cases are 10 years old or 5 years old, so the accrued interest also constitutes a major portion. But this I have heard from Dr. Sahu in the past also, that the earlier the sick person is brought to the hospital, the better is the chance for his cure. But here, Matthew, I will just point out one thing. If I take a single default case to the NCLT, and definitely, if I take it early, then the possibility of resolution is very, very high. But the question is, if I take it to NCLT, there is a one default. The account is still not NPA, and we are making a provision of 0.40%. But RBI, they will say that it has gone to NCLT. This is the liquidation value. So far, the resolution plan has not come. You make higher provision on that. So this is a hit on the P&L. And normally a banker, even if they have sufficient cushion in their balance sheet, they will prefer not to basically take the single default or as we say SMA 0, SMA 1 or SMA 2 to NCLT, because with the risk of making higher provision. So that if suppose I always say that all the stakeholders, that is regulator, the government, the banker, the borrowers, resolution applicant, IP, they should be on the same page in driving this particular process. Otherwise, if everyone is looking like in case of power projects, now that has been addressed to by the respected ministry. Now, the DISCOM companies earlier were saying that this PPA is with X company. Now, if X company is being taken over by Y company, we will not transfer the PPA. The transfer of licenses used to be problem. Now, we are taking it to NCLT, not to continue with the same promoter, because the same promoter has failed. So these are the issues which all the stakeholders in the ecosystem has to basically be on the same page, so that there is the maximum realization on it.
Okay. So I'm afraid it's 8 o'clock, and to bring us to the end of this discussion, very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Pallav, Dr. Sahu, as well as Jayant, for having joined in and told us one very heartening news is that by and large, I think there is agreement that no major change in law is required. It is only trying to get processes in place and trying to improve the working of the code as it stands. So thank you very much, all three of you once again. Thank you also for our wonderful audience for the questions that we got. And also, of course, my colleagues in NCAR who have really helped put this thing together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.